This edition of the Ridley Report is brought to you by
more New Hampshire government misbehavior updates for August 10th, 2020, or at least recorded on August 10th. Now, I don't do interstates much, but I've heard a report that cameras are appearing every half mile on New Hampshire interstates. This is not a very new report. I think I heard this in June. What are you seeing? Also, apparently some of the toll booths, they've been shutting down their cash lanes or whatever, so I've heard, at 8 p.m. So what does this mean? If you're driving up toward one of these things and you don't have an easy pass, do you get trapped there? You have to choose between getting a ticket and just sitting there forever? Because obviously you can't exactly turn around. This makes me want to avoid the interstates even more, especially after hours. On the other side of the coin, maybe this is a pro-government line I'm taking here. Broken clock is right twice a day. I had a thought with regard to masks and the opposition to them. Or it's not so much the opposition to them, but some people, are claiming that they're not useful or that they're doing more harm than good. Recently, I realized, well, if that were the case, wouldn't we have known that many decades ago? Because masks are not exactly a new thing. They were in fairly widespread use during the 1918 crisis. In fact, they used to shoot people in San Francisco for not wearing them. And, despite that being a fascistic move, actually San Francisco came through the crisis pretty well in terms of federal flu numbers. I call it the federal flu, not the Spanish flu, because it originated in an army barracks at Kansas, we think. I don't know, it doesn't seem right that we would suddenly discover just this year that masks don't work. I don't think so. I think we would have already known that. But of course, we don't have a lot of data in terms of how masks work when they are used by the masses. Recently, in an epidemic and or pandemic, that data is new, so okay. Always good to be agnostic until proven otherwise. And so I stay agnostic and stay behind my mask when I'm in a store as best I can, since it's very unlikely I'm going to hurt anyone else by having a mask on. I'm still fighting the mask mandates, don't worry, the government mask mandates. I'm probably fighting them more than you are. I'm just not sure masks themselves are ineffective. I don't buy that. Not yet. I had this thought recently related to what is going to be the societal impact of separating people more than usual? Well, I wonder if maybe it might actually be good for crime rates, and maybe even over the long haul. Now, that doesn't seem to have borne itself out. I'm sure that these Floyd protests and the opportunistic looters who tagged along, perhaps without any ideology of their own in most cases, there may have been an uptick in crime related to that for a couple of weeks. But initially, I guess keeping people apart dropped the crime rate. And I wonder if you keep people apart, they're going to get better at staying apart. Some of them will. They'll learn things to do that they hadn't thought of before. Obviously, there will be backlashes, where people get more together than they normally would, if and when these restrictions are ever lifted. But I wonder if to some extent a culture of independence will be created by it. At least part of our culture will become more independent and more capable of being separated from other people. As someone who kind of likes being separated from other people, not forever, but for fairly extended periods of time, I really do see many advantages. Most problems come from being around other people and interacting with them. Also many beautiful things, but there's a potential silver lining here. If people learn how to be less dependent on one another, that's great. And to some extent, in a social context, I think they are probably doing that. On the other hand, the government is swooping in and ruining it by making everyone more dependent on them. now that they've established a precedent of repeated handouts to everyone, no strings attached and no questions asked, well, although I didn't get one, they'll be in a position soon where they can't stop without riots and so forth. So that would mean they have to keep doing it, and if they have to keep doing it, then that means hyperinflation. I don't see how hyperinflation could be avoided. If they can't ever stop doing this, probably we'd have a better chance of Trump stopping it than of Biden stopping it, but I can't see him stopping it before November. He's pretty tolerant, not tolerant, that's not right. He's pretty resistant to riots. He doesn't care if people are rioting. He likes to crack heads. So, as long as he doesn't lose an election over it, what the heck, stop the program, it's December, what are they going to do, vote me out? So, that would be my expectation. The least unlikely thing to happen was that this goes on until December, and then Trump stops it after the election. These handouts. We get riots anyway if Trump wins the election. They go on further if he stops the freebies, which he should. He should do it right now. But there's huge value in being able to operate independently. One-man companies, one-man media outlets, and having become the latter after being part of a corporate media outlets, I can tell you the latter, the corporate media outlets were traumatic compared to this, operating alone, with a free hand, free rein, and no one to consult with, except the advertisers and viewers. There was an experience I had when I worked at a small market TV station where I was sent, I was just acing it. There was this incident where a police officer was killed overnight. I was the only media person in the entire region, in the entire viewing area, all of the newspapers, all of the radio. No one else knew that this had happened except me, because I listened to my scanner in my sleep. And I went driving out there to the scene, maybe 60 miles away, and I had this whole story to myself for about 3 hours. No one I could call and talk to about it, at the station. They were all asleep. No one to help me. Just my car, my camera. And sheriff's officers let me tag along with them as they were pointing their shotguns into empty rail cars. I was able to stand, 4 feet away from where the incident happened. A Texas Ranger, I was working in East Texas, a Texas Ranger threatened to arrest me for nothing in particular. It was really an important scene. They let me into areas where most travel was banned. I guess the police must have been pretty schizophrenic if they were being so nice to me and bad to me at the same time. But then help showed up. The TV station sent a second crew. And from there on, everything just went downhill and became more and more disastrous. Now, maybe some of that was my fault. Maybe some of it was theirs. I don't remember exactly everything that went wrong. This was 1990, I think. But the point is, once you get groups of people communicating together, you get so much more miscommunication than you do when you're just communicating with, yourself. I'm sure the public would have been better served if all three of us had been operating independently. And there certainly would be fewer personality conflicts. There's a reason why most crime is in cities, right? Because people are too close to each other in their physical proximity. They're interacting with each other too much. And maybe some good can come of that reducing. Now, some positive news from the government in New Hampshire. We now have America's first flying car allowance legislation. In other words, they're allowing flying cars. Not so much in the air, but they're working. They've got a law that lets you drive your flying car on the road, which is probably the more important part. Only 103 years late, the first flying car prototype was built, or at least designed, in 1917. I've always thought of it as a 1960s technology because there were actual cars in the air. There were flying cars in the 60s. Now, apparently, there are 3 different companies you can buy one from. maybe around the 2016 era, I was at the State House, and I interviewed some state reps about flying cars, and they looked at me like I was from the moon, because they didn't think it was super relevant to what they were doing. It was, I guess, like a transportation committee or something like that. They were trying to do some new spending on transportation, and I wanted to know why it was the year 2016 and we were still relying on roads. Was it their continued failure to allow flying cars? But now they're allowing them. So I guess I went from Mondo batshit to mainstream in just 4 years. And on the same page, on the same news page, there's another headline. It says United Emirates set to launch mission to Mars. Okay, so that's pretty off topic, but it did get me thinking. I had one of those ideas that no one else ever seems to have, so got to share it. Might as well do it now. Do we really need a 25th rover on Mars? Or, probe, or whatever it is. Whatever we already have about 25 of. I already know what Mars looks like. I don't even pay any attention when there's a new Mars probe landing. It doesn't matter. Yes, it does usually some minor thing that hasn't been done before. It doesn't ever do the major thing that hasn't been done. There was only one major, important, cool test that was ever done on Mars, right? And that was the one in the original Viking lander where they tested for life. It was a nice test. And it had interesting results. Ambiguous, possibly pro-life. The person who designed the test thinks it was a life reading. But that test has never been done again, even though the results were ambiguous. If they're sending a probe to do that, then okay. But otherwise, I just don't care. Well, maybe if it's going to dig down 30 feet, that might be. Again, that's different than you, too. But it would have to test for life. There's no other reason to be there, is there? Okay, I can think of one other useful thing to do with a probe on Mars. If you drop one down, if there's going to be a stupid manned mission there anyway, then you might as well drop a probe that has stuff on it that would be useful to the men. Right? All right, sorry, that sounded sexist, but you know what I'm saying. Actually, it's more likely that if people go to Mars, they'll be women, like an all-women crew. Apparently, there are some things they're discovering about women that would indicate they're better in deep space. But anyway, if they're going to launch a probe to Mars, what about instead, why not launch, for the same price, you could probably launch 2 probes to the moon. And yes, there's already plenty of probes on the moon, but you could launch probes on the moon that have goodies on them, like that people could use. You could start the process of creating a manned space station, a manned lunar station. Now, a manned lunar station, unlike these useless orbiting things they've got going with people in them, and these useless 57th probe to Mars missions, you could actually have a useful device sitting on the moon there waiting for people to land next to it. It could just have, if it just had candy bars in it, it would be worth its weight in platinum, right? Start the process of pre-supplying the first lunar manned station. It won't be a colony at first, it'd be like, a couple people there for a while. But at least it will be on solid ground next to matter, which, like candy bars, is worth its weight in platinum when it's in space. People are so, this is like a genetic human flaw, apparently, or an ingrained human flaw, and that is that they want to think off into the far distance, but they don't want to think about the things they could do now. It's like Mark Edge used to say, people don't actually want to fight for freedom, they just want to talk about it on the internet. So instead of doing something now, which they probably should have done in the 70s, to support a viable human presence, a resupplyable human presence, close by, in space, sustainable, on a planetary body, or a heavenly body that is probably twice as habitable as Mars, and easy to communicate with, practical to resupply, nearly 100% predictable in its weather and solar patterns, cheaper, at least, doable. Instead of doing that, they want to go straight for the Hail Mary pass to create something that's ultimately probably going to be another Apollo 13 or, Apollo 11 type situation where you accomplish something stellar at heavy cost in human life, and then you do nothing for 100 years. I mean, it's definitely more likely to achieve that result than moon stuff is. If you can get people on the moon, and you can resupply them, make it sustainable, get good robots in action there, you can build something that lets you get to the rest of the solar system easy. It's easy to leave the moon. It's not easy to leave the Earth. Or, by the way, Mars. A place which would be declared a toxic waste dump if you were to move an acre of it to the Earth. They say just eating food grown out of Martian soil would be like smoking. Yes, eventually they could get around these problems, but why go the extra billion miles to have those problems, along with an atmosphere that's just in the way, a gravity well that is twice as heavy as that of the moon, making it harder to leave, a lack of real-time communications, an inability to resupply. Look, on the moon, they wouldn't even have to give up the internet. It's the perfect stepping stone. And all these people wasting their money on Mars, something unsustainable probably, in the short term, are just flying right past the moon, forgetting it's even there. Well, what would you think if in the year 2200 they were just flying past Mars, forgetting it's there, so they can go to Io and all die in a crash and dash mission that has no chance of being sustainable or resupplyable? You would agree with me that that was crazy, wouldn't you? But you've got Mars in your eyes. You can't wait to get to that toxic waste dump and die. Maybe even in a dust storm that never happens on the moon, which you just flew past. I don't get it. And these orbital missions are even worse. Are they even learning anything from these things? Here's your $4 billion 1% treatment improvement for bone loss. Yeah, they learned a lot getting there to a place that you can't stay, and then they just kept staying. Sort of. Kept reinforcing the unsustainable location. Orbital presence of humans is not sustainable until there is cheap launch technology or lunar launch facilities. They have not pursued the second of these at all, as best I can tell. And the first has come about only very slowly. And the crazy thing is, you would expect distortions like this when the government is doing this stuff. But private markets seem to be falling into the same trap. I just don't know, when is someone going to rediscover the moon? On the downside, in New Hampshire, Keene State College students have returned to class. That's probably bad enough. But I wanted to draw your attention to some of the restrictions that are listed at keene.edu. For these helpless 20-year-olds who don't yet know how to exercise their rights and are going into the world, babes in the woods, living under a fascistic system without knowing it, I have no idea how I got through college safely. So, a quote, avoid social gatherings on and off campus involving groups of more than 10 people. Unquote. Quote, wear a mask at all times on campus except when in my residence hall room, off-campus living spaces, or eating while seated. Unquote. So they have effectively banned eating while standing outdoors on the Keene State College campus. Their student code of conduct page there at keene.edu also had what I think are some pre-existing regulations that are even more disturbing, and which you paid for, even if you don't live in New Hampshire. So this is related to student disciplinary hearings or code of conduct hearings. It says, quote, the rights of the parties involved are acknowledged, unquote. Okay, so far so good. Let's see if the parties actually have any rights. Quote, all hearing board proceedings are recorded by the Student Conduct Office, but recordings are not permitted by other parties, unquote. So apparently, the students don't have any free press rights. Those are actually the rights that are arguably the most important ones when you're in court or in a disciplinary hearing. And later on, quote, the audio recordings are the property of the college and may not be duplicated without the permission of the Director of Student Conduct or a designee. Students who may be preparing an appeal can request to review the original recording, the official recording, unquote. Media and third parties are banned from these hearings that they paid for. That's not a quote. That's just something that a piece of information I collected from this page. So I have I have just realized that I've already reported on this right here on my channel, and I'm duplicating myself. All right, I will say no more. Some positive news. According to the union leader, the former police chief of Bartlett in New Hampshire is calling for getting rid of the so-called Lorry List and firing the officers on it. The Lorry List is the secret government roster of a list of cops with credibility problems. So rather than getting rid of it, it would be nice to just publicize it, but former Chief Janet Champlin says, quote, I know of no other profession where there is a secret list like this. They should be fired. There should be absolutely no place in law enforcement for them, unquote. She goes on to say, quote, I don't understand how you have this secret list of officers. You can't keep officers on desk duty who have no credibility to be on the street to make arrests or to testify in court. You can't be half in. It's a disservice to the good officers in this state to have this list, unquote. Yeah, and I think that's an advantage of having the Lorry List. It makes a good whipping boy for the ACLU and those of us who are cop watchers. It makes all cops, suspect of being on the list, reducing the overall credibility of all police in New Hampshire. And I like the idea of reducing their credibility. The less credibility they have, the less enforcement power they'll have. And the more cautious they'll have to be. What's dangerous is when police seem credible, even though they're not. But yeah, my thinking is the list should just be publicized. She's probably right. The list, well, she's right about firing the officers, and the list should be publicized. But the important thing is that they not rehire, they not fill the positions after they fire a cop. They should not fill the position. Unfortunately, the chief is making other recommendations that are less pro-freedom because they would cost money. So, Civilian Review Board to investigate all police uses of deadly force, mandatory training on ethics and racial bias, and recruitment policies to promote diversity. Actually, a Civilian Review Board, maybe that could be set up without taxpayer expense, so that might be okay, but probably wouldn't be very effective. I was also pleased to see that the former head U.S. Marshal, Stephen Monier, he's also used to be Goffstown Police Chief, has made some constructive statements. He says, quote, we have to afford due process to those who are accused, but after adjudication of a criminal or administrative nature, if we shine the light of day on these cases, that would go a long way to improving accountability, unquote. All right, that's all I have to report for now. More later. God willing.
Driving in circles around Central Keene, I hurl both insults, angry and mean, against the activists from Free Keene. who wander around thinking as though they were free, and even though they aren't hurting me, I will hate them hatefully, urging their appearance in the penitentiary, although that expense would be charged to me. I'm starting to feel somewhat confusedly.